Hello, my name is Zachary Green, and I welcome you to this session called Many Happy Returns. Our focus here is going to be on an exploration of return to office policies and practices, with a special emphasis on the psychological or the emotional factors that are involved in that process. I would propose that in order to really participate in this, that you participate by having a paper and maybe a pen next to you, or scroll along on your computer, so that you can begin to think about where you are in this process and how to have that work for you. And so this is going to be more of a journey. And so please go on this journey with me. Okay. Thank you. So let's get an overview. So the overview of this process is on the next slide here, where it says that what we're really looking at is that many of us are rapidly approaching, regionally at least, a question of how are we going to meet the challenges of returning to the office. Many nonprofits are grappling with that, and some nonprofits are saying, wait, we never left the office. We've been in the community and working diligently this entire time. But there are other places where there is a need for fair, safe, and transparent practices so that when we are back to what some are calling normal, well, what I call the new now, how do we give focus to the practical considerations that are inherent in that? What are the psychological factors that are part of that? And what do we as nonprofit leaders and agents do to make sure that we balance all of that out in this new now? So let me give you a sense of what the flow of this is going to be. And so the next slide speaks to the flow of that process. So the flow of this is that what we're going to be doing is the first chunk is we're going to attend to best practices. And then we're going to look at inclusion, diversity considerations, not in the sort of DEI sense of it, or diversity, equity, and inclusion sense of it, but some of the kinds of factors to make sure that our approaches are equitable. Then we will attend to the psychological factors, and then we will look at just a way to close this out by thinking about the practice and the presence that is necessary to do this effectively. In order to do this, there were a number of sources that I went to. And so if we can see where I went to begin to pull this together, those sources included the Nonprofit Quarterly, the Center for Disease Control, University of San Diego Nonprofit Institute, through one of its classes, did an absolutely wonderful study in terms of how we think about some of the factors that are involved here. We also looked at OSHA, McKinsey, and PricewaterhouseCoopers. All of these were sort of blended together to give you this amalgamation of approaches that I'm going to be presenting to you today. What I would suggest to you is that any of these sources may be ones that you want to consider as well, so that you have another way, another place, another space to go beyond what I present in these 45 minutes to find out what works best for you. Okay, so those are the sources that I use, and I would recommend that you do the same. And so let's go and see what are these best practices. So when we begin to think about going back to the office, we really need to just pay attention to what are some of these practices. And so we're going to be looking in 5 specific areas. And so the 5 areas that we're going to be looking at are: number 1, and that's the next slide here, where it begins to speak to the kinds of ways that we look at the place and how we place people and safety first. I want to put great emphasis on that because everything that I'm talking about is really dependent on that foundation. If there is a way that you and I begin to put safety and people first, then everything else flows from there. The next part of it is then how do we really engage staff? Engaging staff in terms of their input into the process is absolutely key because none of us, at least in the last century, have gone through anything in terms of a disease process that has affected us so dramatically collectively. The next part is to look at your existing policies, how you review and craft those. And then the next part of that is then the whole communication part of this, because you can have wonderful policies. You can think that they're well thought out. But the reality here is that there may be different ways, different kinds of needs that people have to feel engaged in that. And then how do you go with the implementation? So all of that we're going to talk about, and that's just to get us started. So let's begin to look at the first of these, which is really talking about people first. So what I want you to do is sort of, again, journey with me on this in terms of how are you doing on these elements. It doesn't mean that you have to have all these perfectly, and it may be that we're already down the road on these, but let's look at them. And if it feels like, this is something I'm already doing, that's great. But there may be a nugget here or there that you haven't thought about or that you might want to consider that I invite you to also put into your considerations here. First of which, and I want to continue to stress this, is to think about the health and safety of all. Now, health and safety, of course, has to do with the contracting of the SARS novel virus here, COVID-19 as we call it. But the other part of this in terms of health and safety, which is underestimated, is the impact that this is having psychologically and emotionally on people as they return. The impact of closing down, there are recent studies that show that even our brain physiology has been shifted because we have been closed down because of the absence of certain levels of stimulation that come from human interaction, that it's going to take the plasticity of our neurology to catch up with being connected together. And so this is to really say that then how do we attend to the complexities of what health really means here? We also want to assure that the space, just on a very basic level, has been cleaned. Well, we haven't used it for a year. Why is that an issue? The perception that some action has been taken to mitigate against the presence of the virus is important psychologically to just indicate that we are attending to the reality of this circumstance. And following state guidance and agency protocols. The city, the county, the state, of course, have protocols that they are recommending on this. Some of us are part of larger agencies or larger entities or larger systems that also have policies. That does not negate, however, the responsibility that each of us has in our smaller units to make sure that we are also paying attention to what is needed for us. Whether I'm an office of 3 to 5 people or whether I'm one of the larger nonprofits here with 500 to 1,000 people, it is important to consider together what are the protocols that we have around safety? What are the protocols that we have about keeping people first? Clean, outdate, discarded in BC before COVID, consumables. You know that refrigerator, that microwave, that cupboard, those special snacks that you had? They're probably hidden somewhere. Get rid of all that stuff. The importance of that is that we really want to communicate that this is a fresh start, that this is a renewal. And all of this may seem trivial on some level, but it's also key because then we want to continue to have the hygiene practices that and so that the sanitizers and the like are as easy and accessible because it signals that we are still attending the folks right now. So what I want you to do before I go to the next slide is to think about where you are in terms of these. You said, got all of that, no problem. Okay, that's great. So then that means that you're farther along than a lot of people. And so your organization is there. But if you haven't attended to all of these, make sure that you attend to these. So I'll give you 30 seconds to think about that. Because as you're thinking about this, I want you to know where OSHA is on this. So OSHA speaks to the next slide. And so OSHA says to us that we as employers have a responsibility to create spaces of employment. And I put this as in bold here, free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm. You say, well, wait a minute. Most of the folks that I work with are vaccinated. So what is the issue here? The issue here is that we still have the responsibility. And so as long as there is any threat related to the virus, and in terms of the potential that it has, those factors that we have been using for the last almost year and a half to make certain that there's safety still needs to be in place. And so OSHA says we have this responsibility. And I urge all of us to really pay attention to that if there are ways that we can mitigate hazards, that we're attending to that, because that shows that we are taking people first and that we're taking safety first. Okay, now, all right, I did all of that. So what about the staff? Well, what we are finding, and this is in terms of best practices, is that to survey the staff in terms of what they want in terms of return to office preferences does not necessarily mean that that is what happens, but it is important in terms of a sense of agency at your agency for people to feel like they had their voice in it. Because all of what has been going on really is something that has robbed people from a sense of their own liberty. And as a consequence of that, we've seen all kinds of reactions to that across the country and across the planet, really. And as a consequence of that, we as nonprofit professionals really have a responsibility to invite voice to this process. And then what that then allows us to do is to listen to people's experiences of what it was like to do remote work. There are various ways that people have gone into remote work. Some people have loved it, that has been ideal for them. Others cannot wait to get back to a regular office routine. This continuum of where people may be on this is something that we will need to work on. And so, really, just not only surveying like what do you want to do here, but also what has it been like for you for the last year and a half. In addition to that, it is important to note that there are certain common concerns that are likely to arise wherever you are. So, wherever you are, what are those common concerns? And then, once there is a sense of those common concerns, then how do you make sure that you work on those in terms of recommendations and that the recommendations reflect the staff? Because then any proposal that you have also has to balance that. Some offices are returning everybody at the same time. Other offices are doing a staggered approach where one set of people have been or will be at work. Another set of people are coming in, and then it expands to a wider circle, and then to a wider circle. We've seen this done very successfully in a number of public education situations. But some offices have already decided that they are now and forever in a hybrid model where people will continue to have the option of remote work, but they will also have a way to engage with the office and people will move back and forth. And there are some offices that are completely now remote. Now, where you are in that may have a different balance. And so it's important in terms of gaining staff input, learning what preferences are, how all of that works together. So McKinsey helps us a little bit in terms of thinking about that. But I want you to look, I'm sorry, 30 seconds. Look where you are in terms of gaining staff input and say, okay, do we have this down? Are there other things that we need to consider in terms of staff input? Okay. Now we go to McKinsey. What McKinsey has found as they're doing studies of both the private sector and the public sector and the nonprofit sector is that a staged return is the smartest approach. By what that does is that it confirms to your employees that, we're going to reopen. Sure, we're going to reopen. But it brings people together in a way that the socialization aspect of coming back to work is also placed into consideration. They're, old school introvert, extrovert, and there are going to be different ways that people feel about this coming back. And it's highly recommended that you think about bringing back people in a way that it's much more iterative. Now, that doesn't mean that that works for you. If you're a small office of 5, let's everybody come back at the same time. But if you're in a larger office, how you scale this, how you approach this is also important. Okay, now let's talk about policy. This is the conundrum. Policy is a big deal here. So let me talk to you about what we mean by policy. When we look at policy, what we're talking about is that you probably have practices and policies that were already in place. That's not the problem. The problem is that how we think about sick leave, how we think about care for family members is probably shifted as a course of the pandemic. There are some people who are depending on being able to do that, at least in the short and medium term. And do your policies reflect that? I know that some organizations are just going back without even thinking about that. And so these policies are still in place. The review allows you to look for where there may be gaps right now and where there can be flexibility in the moment. Whatever shifts that you may make, then they need to be written down, at least as interim policies, so that there is a way that everyone can engage this new set of standards and practices. And these are especially in terms of what you mean around remote work and what is allowable practice, or what you mean in terms of flex time and arrival and departure and things of that sort. These are just some of the basics, but there are many more that need to be considered. And so, how you write those down, how you make those available is absolutely key. And now, in terms of policy and review, how you think about the use of space and decisions about the use of space, and even small changes in the configuration of the space will be important in terms of return to work. That's way too much resources, too much manpower, human power that is required of that, granted. But any kinds of shifts that you can make that will give, again, like we did with safety and people first, that will allow you to see that some shift is being made is key. And then these are to be communicated in a way that has timeliness to it, in terms of what will be the timeline for it, what will be the ramp up for it, and what will be the start date or dates if you do a staggered approach. And then how you do this needs to be early and often. Okay, so again, look, where are you in that process? Let's go back to the previous slide so that people can see for a second. Where are you in terms of review? Where are you in terms of crafting your policies? Okay, so check that out first. Okay, now let's go to the big question, the vaccine mandate. What decision is your organization making around this? As you know, the whole notion of the vaccine is a political hotbed. It is a representation of the inherent political divides in our country. Where you stand on that personally is less relevant as it is in terms of how you communicate what is going on here. So let's look at what I've already learned just here in San Diego. So vaccine mandate is being handled in a couple ways. So let's look at the next slide here, and a couple cases here. There is one community-based nonprofit with whom I work where there is no vaccine mandate for the staff. There is no requirement of there being any kind of disclosure of vaccine status by staff or any person that works with that organization. There's periodic testing that is recommended, I repeat, recommended, but is not required. And then what is required is a sort of a self-monitoring of symptoms. And they have chosen to put the emphasis on privacy and that they want there to be what they call no vaccine hesitancy shaming. Okay, That's one approach. There's another organization with whom I work. They not only have a vaccine mandate, they are making it required that vaccine status has to be not only disclosed, it has to be documented. So the little vaccine card have to upload it, send it in to the human resources. There is also a deadline by which these vaccine cards must be presented and disclosed in order for people to return to that office. And in addition to that, there is implicit but not direct suggestion that employment is under consideration based on how well a person complies with this. And that continued health and safety screening of those is also still needed. Okay, so there we are with that. So here, no, stay with the previous slide. So the previous slide, please. So now you're a nonprofit. Where are you? Chances are you're someplace on the continuum between these two. And so what you decide about the vaccine mandate is something that you can think about in terms of how you survey your own staff. It is also something you have to think about in terms of your personal values as a leader in the organization, how much you trust the efficacy of the science of the vaccine and what it is already showing in terms of San Diego County, in terms of our return to something that resembles a different kind of approach to being present to one another professionally and personally. So think about it. So give yourself a second to think about where are we in terms of the vaccine mandate? Your choice, but think about it. All right, next. Now we're ready. Okay, so after the vaccine mandate, then the question that we begin to have is that, go beyond the vaccine mandate. So, because what we want to talk about now is communicating all of this. So the next slide is on communicating. And so the communication of this is around compliance, clarity, connection, confidence, and culture. Okay, so these 5 C's. So what is necessary is number one is to communicate this compliance parts of this. That's what we just talked about the mandate. And so what are the compliance parts of the guidance that you are going to have? There are both the state and county and city and agency protocols around this, but there are also elements of this in terms of your own policies that will be put into place. And so all of that has to be determined. So the compliance issues up front. Second part, the clarity of this. There can be a lot of ambiguity in how we communicate what is going on in terms of return to office. So if it is spelled out in some of the ways that I already talked about, in some ways that I will talk about in a moment, that would be important. The next part of it is to talk about the connection, the sort of emotional support, the sort of ways that we are dealing with the social emotional aspect of what it means to be together collectively once more, so that there is a sense of confidence that we are going to be rebuilding trust. And the rebuilding trust is building the scaffolding around how we engage the staff, how we make sure that we're taking a focus on people first and safety. And that we are doing this in such a way that we are strongly considering their input into this process. Because all of that is about the last part, is that what kind of post-pandemic culture are we trying to create together? Okay, take a moment to look at that, see where you are with that, and how ready are you in each of these places? Okay. So I'm going to give you a couple checklists here. Here's a communications checklist. So the communications checklist looks like this. Okay, so the return to workplace checklist involves these elements. So the first part of this is for you to think about what are you trying to achieve here in terms of communicating to everybody? What's the objective? You know? How well are you doing on each of these? Did you already gather the feedback from your staff? And so, what do I want to communicate? Did I gather the impact, the feedback? And then, how do you make sure you communicate this in such a way that when everyone is returning, they have a sense of where all the guidance is and things of that sort. All right. So those are the first three. How are you doing on that? Okay, good. All right. Now, what is the best fit for the channels of communication? Is this an email blast? Is this a one-on-one Zoom call with people? According to the size of your office, there may be different ways of doing it. I work in a place where it's done by email and you sort of have to catch up with that. I work in another place where it is done face to face, and another place it has been in like circle to the degree that we're in these rectangles on Zoom. But by circle, what I mean is that it is really done in a round robin conversation where we reach consensus together about how we want to do this. The leaders and the managers not only have to support this, they have to model the communications that are going on, and that this is something that's long term. Those of you who are in larger nonprofits where you have an HR department or an HR person, this is done in collaboration with them. Where you are HR as well as the CEO, then how you think about this in terms of the culture that you're creating long term is also key. So, in terms of these 6 elements of communication, where are you and how are you doing? So, think about that for 30 seconds. All right. Now, let's kind of review where we've been. So, return to office has a number of elements to it. The most important ones are really, really about people first and safety first. So all of that is something that we've been talking about from the beginning of this, and I want to, continue to emphasize it. And I think you get it, so I won't hit it again. The next part is how well have you prepared the office, and how well are you going to be doing in terms of making sure that everything is in place for people to return. Okay, next. Uh, what is guidance in terms of the policies, guidelines, in terms of the return? How well are you communicating that? And then once you do it, that's not it. You have to implement this in such a way that you're gathering input about how is it going. Just because you've developed the policy and the plan and people are beginning to show up, it doesn't mean that it's working for everybody in the same kind of way. So how do you continue to have the conversation about that going forward? Okay. So again, now let's look at the sort of review list here and let's see how you're doing. Okay. 5 for 5, 3 out of 5. Ooh, we're just on number 1 here. Whatever it is, that's where you are. And now you know where you can also go. And again, the other sources that I talked about give a deeper and fuller guidance, but this is just a way to have the conversation. Okay. Now, it would be easy to stop here and say, okay, that was good. Okay, but we're not done because there are diversity and inclusion considerations in this process. There's some priorities that we also need to think about in terms of the nature of the human condition, in terms of diversity and inclusion. So the next slide is a pretty slide that tells us that we have to go beyond policies and practices to begin to think about diversity and inclusion. And by that, what I mean is that where the next slide goes is 6 categories of things that I think will be absolutely key for you to think about. So if we go to the next slide that speaks to the diversity and inclusion elements, they are number 1, the social economic factors. What does that mean? There are all kinds of economic considerations that are involved in this process. Some nonprofits do have a stratification around economics, and that some folks have to return to office and can't have their work threatened because they're still living paycheck to paycheck, and all kinds of problems have existed. And you, as an organization, may have been strapped because of the decline in giving that some organizations have experienced during the pandemic. So the social economic needs of you as an organization and as your staff as a whole have to be balanced against this. And they're going to be different needs. And sometimes these won't be expressed, but they need to be understood. So that is a consideration. Representation equity. Now, representation equity has two levels to it. One is this sort of social identity equity in terms of gender, orientation, racial composition of your office, and things of that sort. That's one level of representation. The other level of representation is like professional staff and essential workers. So those people who are essential workers may have never left the office. In other words, they have been working and delivering services all through this pandemic. And your nonprofit may be one like that, but other nonprofits have people that have been delivering as essential workers this entire time, but have other workers who have not seen the office for a year and a half. Now, what do you do in terms of representation equity in that? How do you make sure that your policies reflect the need to have everyone be required or not to be there? But if my job doesn't require me to be at the office, why should I go in? There's an equity issue that also has to be balanced against the nature of the professional organizational process that's gone on here. This is a conversation, and it's one that needs often to be engaged if you're a larger nonprofit around the senior management to understand this together and to make recommendations. But it's also something where you engage the staff to begin to talk about that and what kinds of shifts you may need to make. Health and wellness. There are people who have long COVID. There are people that are recovering from COVID. There are people who have family members who are still affected by the virus. So that be balanced in. There are caregiving responsibilities. What a lot of families have found, especially families with elder care and younger child care, that this has actually been an advantage to be able to work and be able to fit their work in while also attending to children and also attending to elders. And then there's a skill set mix. Who are the people that you need in the office to make sure that that sort of creativity and energy is generated? And then finally, how can the roles that you had before the pandemic be reimagined to meet the moment that we're in right now? Are there shifts in priorities of professional and other responsibilities that might need to be considered? And I invite all of you to look at these six and then also fold those into your conversations. So look at these six. Think about, oh, at least one of these I may need to think about further. And please do so. Now let's go to PricewaterhouseCoopers, because what Pricewaterhouse says here, and this is really, quite important, and that's the next slide, is that Pricewaterhouse says that, what we need to recognize is that your employees may have specific needs in this COVID situation. They may be at risk in their health category. They may have a household member who's at risk, and they may be unable to send their children to daycare or to school. And so all of these things, while it is shifting, it isn't over. And so these are some factors that need to be there. Now, we think that's enough? No, we have one more set of things to consider, which are the emotional factors. And so if we go to the next slide, let's begin to look at some of the emotional and psychological factors that are involved there. And the most important emotional factor that I am finding in consulting to organizations on this is the next word, which is fear. And so let's go and look at the fear. Let's begin to understand what the fear is about. So the next slide is on fear, okay? And it really means that the fear is around virus, variants, and various other things. These three V's, okay? And then one of these V's is not vaccine, because the fear indeed is for some around the vaccine. But let's talk about even within this. And why do I say virus? Well, because of this. The next slide speaks to with the virus. What is going on is that we already know that the virus is mutating. So, as a consequence of that, the inoculation that people are having does not guarantee is 94% efficacy with at least Pfizer and Moderna, according to science. But what is happening that is that it does not mean that you cannot contract COVID. There's a basketball player who had the vaccine, okay, but still contracted COVID. Okay, and therefore the ability to transmit it is still present. So this is a fear that some have. Now, the next fear that people have is around the second V, which is variance. So if we go to the next slide, what we have is that what we already know is that in the UK, in the United Kingdom, the variant around the Delta variant is beginning to express itself. 41% of the new cases in the UK are the Delta variant. So what is to say that the current inoculation rate, which is not, by the way, at the herd immunity level, is going to work yet. And so therefore, how do we know that this is going to work? And then the last part is the various. Okay, and what I mean by various is this. The next slide speaks to various. Okay, is that since we haven't reached herd immunity, which seems to be at least at 70%, then what could happen is that we could find ourselves right back in the situation that we were just a month ago. And so all of this is a fear that people are having and are carrying with them, whether it's expressed or not. But there are other psychological factors, and I want to at least present some of these briefly before we end this session. The first of which is around grief, and I'm sorry that this slide didn't balance out, but what this basically says is that this is also a time of mourning. This is a time of grief. And there are many ways that we grieve because whatever we had a year and a half ago is gone. But some of us say we're returning back to normal. Yes, but I think this return to normal is a defense, if you will. I'm a psychologist, I get to say these things. Is a defense against being able to recognize how much has changed. So let me talk to you about some of the emotional factors that we need to think about. So the next slide speaks to those emotional factors. Number one, stress, trauma, grief. But on the other side is resilience, connection, and creativity. But let's first talk about the stress part of this. So the next slide speaks to stress. The stress part of this is that some of us have had a level of pressure in this thing where you can see that we are not at our optimal level of performance on any level. And so what is happening is that the possibility of burnout is greatly increased at this particular moment because we're trying to perform well, trying to move back into the situation, but we're feeling the incredible pressure. And so I would ask you to think about, where are you in this? I usually find myself in the place of strain. Perhaps you feel yourself in that place of stretch. Wherever you are in that, this is affecting us. The next part of what is affecting us is trauma. What do you mean by trauma? I'm not feeling any trauma. We are all in trauma because there was an inescapable, stressful event that overwhelms people's existing coping mechanisms. The entire last year and a half, irrespective of how well we may have gotten through it, is something that was outside of the normal scope of our experience. So the next slide then sort of speaks to how this sort of trauma then works to us. Because what happens is that 100% of us are a part of a collective trauma experience. Even if you had a good pandemic, meaning that there were things that you were able to learn and reflection and healthcare and things of that sort, it does not mean that this wasn't a traumatic event in the collective experience. And as a consequence of that, and that's where the next slide goes, is that then what we have is that there are all kinds of trauma that then come together in what we call here intersectional trauma. And that is, it happened to all of us, even though differently. And then when we add to it that this pandemic also included the political divides of this moment, it also included the racial divides and the upturning, you know, let me calm down. What it also included the sort of racial tensions that are continuing to be present. Then all of these things come together, and then this is the next slide that shows it. All of us are feeling some element of these traumas coming together and affecting us. Okay? So all of us are having some blend of historical issues, vicarious issues, knowing people that have died, the grief of this. And through the next slide, then what you're going to then see is that we are on a journey of this. Some of us are already at acceptance and hope, but others of us are still in this depression and loneliness that came from this experience. And we're trying to turn upwards, but you can see even in that turn upwards, it can go backwards. And some people are still just angry about what this has been about. And so all of these grief responses are a part of this. And I would invite you to think about, where are you in that? And where might people in your office be around this? And then another consideration is this. If we take it to the next slide, then what we begin to see is that we want to find resilience. And this is an opportunity for resilience. It's an opportunity for us to figure out how we can adapt and learn from the situation and not simply be closed down by it. We also want to be able to then look at these 6 again. And that's what the next slide goes, is that these emotional factors then allow us for the potential of connection and creativity with one another. If we are able to find a way to adapt, if we're able to find ways to work together, then it allows for a creative moment to emerge from this in a way that we did not possibly consider. So where is all of this going? And so let's close with this. This presentation has been about many happy returns. And so when we say many happy returns, as the next slide indicates, many happy returns is about people first, preparation, policy, and practice of presence. This is the one element that I would like you to think about. If you can sort of hold these together, then we are in a position where we're really ready to say welcome back. Where if we begin to think about going back to the office or going to the office, because it's not back, it's a new place. It's different from where it was a year ago. So the final slide is this. Let's say welcome back. But let's do this in terms of people, preparation, policy, practice, and presence. Let's really make sure that the people are first. Let's do the preparation by engaging people in conversation about what it really means, not only in terms of policy, but what it also means interpersonally, to just be in this space again. Let's make sure that we're putting in place practices, not just practices in terms of washing the hands with sanitizers, but practices that are attending to the complexities of the human condition. And then we, as people who have been as part of this workshop and a part of this, that we practice presence. And what I mean by that we're modeling this ourselves, that we're bringing this forward ourselves. And then with that, then we're ready to return to the office. Okay, and with that, I want to say thank you, welcome back, and let's see how it all goes. Okay.